Good afternoon, everybody. I am Sarah Dash, President and CEO of the Alliance for Health Policy, a nonpartisan resource for the policy community dedicated to advancing knowledge and understanding of health policy issues. Welcome to today's webinar. We launched this webinar series to provide insight into the status of the COVID-19 response and shed light on remaining gaps in the system that must be addressed to limit the severity in the United States. The Alliance gratefully acknowledges the National Institute for Healthcare Management Foundation and the Commonwealth Fund for supporting our COVID-19 webinar series. You can join today's conversation on Twitter using the hashtag AllHealthLive and follow us at AllHealthPolicy. We want you all to be active participants, so please get your questions ready. Here's how to ask a question. You should see a dashboard on the right side of your web browser with a speech bubble icon with a question mark. You can use that icon to notify us about any technical issues and submit questions you have for the panelists at any time. We will collect those and address as many as possible during today's broadcast. Check out our website, allhealthpolicy.org, for background materials and a recording of today's webinar, which will be made available there soon. As government and healthcare leaders look for ways to ease social distancing measures and return to some semblance of normalcy, we know that a safe and effective vaccine is the most promising tool to combat this pandemic. Currently, there are dozens of candidates in development that must undergo rigorous evaluation before they become widely available. Today, we will discuss the steps necessary to bring vaccines from the lab to the front lines. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing our distinguished panelists. First, we have L.J. Tan, who is the Chief Strategy Officer at the Immunization Action Coalition. Before this role, LJ was the Director of Medicine and Public Health at the American Medical Association. He was the AMA's Director of Infectious Disease, Immunology, and Molecular Medicine for 10 years. Next, we're delighted to have Esther Krofah joining us. Esther is the Executive Director of FasterCures, a center of the Milken Institute. She was previously Director of Public Policy at GlaxoSmithKline and served as the Deputy Director for the HHS Office of Health Reform. Thank you both for joining us today. I'm now going to turn it over to LJ Tan for opening remarks. LJ, go ahead.
Oh, thank you very much, Sarah. Really appreciate the opportunity to do this. And I have some slides, and I hope you all can screen capture this, and I think we'll try to make this available later so that you can get a lot of this information in front of you, since 5 minutes is actually going to be very, very fast. So if we can skip the first 3 slides of disclaimers and stop at this one. I've been asked to kind of give a very high level view of vaccine development and then kind of wrap up and saying what might have to change in order for a COVID-19 vaccine to get to market quickly. But just to set the background, to remind everybody that even in the traditional sense of the word process, vaccine development is not simple. It can take 10 to 15 years, maybe sometimes as much as 20, costing at least $800 million, even more, with substantial risk to the people who are developing the vaccine. And if you include the cost to build manufacturing facilities, et cetera, the figure can rise to well over $1 billion to bring a vaccine from initiation to market. And as you all know, clinical development involves a very large number of subjects because these vaccines are held to a very high level of efficacy as well as safety, and rightfully so. And then obviously, once a vaccine is being manufactured, there are very stringent quality control criteria that's in place. And then when an organization or a manufacturer files a filing to get approval from the governmental regulatory authorities, there is a very rigorous and in-depth evaluation. So in the United States, obviously, that's the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA. So this is just to show that there's a huge, very complicated development process. And the next slide, I'm hoping to kind of run you through that very quickly with the next slide, please. So as you can see here, this is how we've broken up the vaccine development pathway. So the first step is the pre-IND or investigational new drug step. Then it goes into an investigational new drug application to the FDA. Then there's a licensing process, and then finally, following licensing and distribution of the vaccine, there's obviously a post-approval process as well. And I've highlighted in each of these boxes all the different things that happens at these different phases. So for example, in the investigational, the early conceptual phases, you've got discovery of the vaccine, you've got test tube animal studies, trying to make sure you have a viable vaccine candidate. Once you have that, you then move into the investigational new drug phase, where you then work with the FDA and the regulators essentially to create the human studies that you need to get that vaccine into a final approval filing, which happens at the licensing stage. Once that happens and you get approval for that vaccine, the manufacturers then go into a post-approval process, which requires lots of vaccines to be regularly tested, facility inspection, and so on and so forth. And what I'm going to overlay here as we click through this is the different partners that we have to engage in order to go through this development pathway. So one click shows you that at the conceptual phase, the NIH, DoD tends to take all these basic sciences and translate them into something that can be used eventually by the industry as a vaccine. Industry can also do that. And during this phase, FDA consultation and review is also happening as we go through this process of vaccine development. You do a click, please. Next slide. Next click. Thank you. At this second phase, you can see ASPR and BARDA, for example, with public-private partnerships, which I think we'll hear Esther talk about, will come into play. Click. In that third phase, it tends to move into industry at this point because the industry will shepherd the application to a final licensing process and production of the vaccine for upscaling. And then finally, FDA and industry are involved in that final post-approval phase. And if you go to the final next two slides, we can go ahead and skip this slide and go to the next slide. So if you take that traditional process and think, what do we need to do for COVID-19? These are some of the things that people are talking about with regards to accelerating that process down from that 10 to 15 years to hopefully within a year, year and a half, right? That's what we're kind of looking at. It could be a little bit quicker, but this is what we're looking at. We're looking at, instead of doing sequential clinical trials, we're looking at simultaneous clinical trials. And these simultaneous clinical trials will occur in multiple target populations, so the elderly, the pediatrics, pregnant women, and they'll have to happen in multiple countries with different socioeconomic standings, because you want to make sure that this is advancing globally as well. You'll have adaptive trial designs. What does that mean? What that means is that as trial results come out, they're gathered and in consultation with pre-specified rules that you've done with the FDA, for example, you'll actually modify the trial as it goes forward so that you can continue to improve the approval process, right? So this is what we call an adaptive trial design. And you want to run those trials where results are going to be most likely. So in areas where there are high outbreaks, and that will have to happen regardless of where those areas could be. You want continuous and early collaboration with the regulatory agencies. In the US, it will be the FDA, so that you can ensure a rapid and appropriate approval process. So in other words, you want to keep that going fast and quick. And then you want to have early discussions on how you're going to incentivize scaling up production if you have a candidate vaccine that gets approved, and how are we going to distribute that vaccine fairly and equitably across the globe should this happen, because this is a pandemic. And all of this obviously will require strong global coordination and collaboration. So this is kind of my quick 30,000-foot level. I'm going to stop there and then turn this back to you, Sarah, for our next panelist.
Great. Thank you so much, LJ. And next, we'll hear from Esther Krofah, Executive Director of FasterCures. Esther, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and the opportunity to be able to participate today. And LJ, thank you for going over that overview. Over the last several weeks, as many of us have been watching this pandemic unfold around the world, likewise, we've been tracking these events in the early days, starting in China and then into Europe and then here as well in the United States. One of the things that we wanted to do quite early on was to track the development of treatments and vaccines in response to this coronavirus, which really speaks to our mission and our focus at FasterCures, consistent with how can we accelerate the development of those treatments and vaccines. And like many watching the news media on a daily basis, it's quite difficult to put your arms around where do we stand, what's in development, how fast do we expect to get to a vaccine. Obviously, getting to a vaccine is really what's going to allow us to get back to normal, as we've started to talk about how do we come out of all of this and what does that look like going forward into the future. Having a vaccine is really what's going to allow us to do that. I did want to set this all up in the context of what these other efforts are so that we have a good sense of how vaccines can be thought of in the context of all the different efforts out there to help us really get back to normal. We are tracking treatments where we expect that in the short term, over the next 4 to 6 months likely, we will have a treatment that can help abate the most severe illness from the coronavirus. Now, these are not expected to be cures. These are expected to help individuals either in a preventative mode, as we see data come out of early studies for those who've been exposed or those who are severely ill in ICU. These early treatments are being thought of as either antibody treatments, either those that are recovered from patients who have recovered sufficiently or are developed synthetically. And you may have heard a lot of that discussion in the news media with studies that are underway around an antibody or a monoclonal antibody. We also see efforts underway with an antiviral. We see early data that's come out of studies like remdesivir being developed by Gilead that can, again, help those severely ill patients in ICU. And then we have a number of other technologies being considered. So the idea is that as we wait for the vaccine development timeframe and a candidate to emerge coming out of these clinical trials, that we would have some therapies that can really help particularly those who are in the front lines and are continually exposed to the virus. On the vaccine side, we're tracking 86 vaccine candidates that fall into broad categories, DNA vaccines, RNA vaccines, mRNA vaccines, conjugate vaccines, and so forth. And essentially taking all the different technology capabilities that have been built up over the years and seeing that being rapidly deployed, and we'll talk about this later in the webinar with all these different partnerships to bring their assets to bear to help us accelerate this process. So it's been very encouraging to see these multinational partnerships to encourage acceleration in a process that, as LJ mentioned, would typically take a decade or more, and we can get further into that conversation, Sarah.
Great. Thank you so much, Esther, for that overview. That's really, really helpful. Let me just start with following up on the point you just made about public-private partnerships. And I want to, again, encourage our audience to send in your questions using your question mark icon. Can you just give a little bit more context as to the market dynamics that surround vaccine development and what does the investment landscape look like? And what's the role of these public-private partnerships in accelerating the development of a vaccine?
Right, Sarah. So when we look at the global vaccine market, at least in 2016, it was valued at $31 billion. It's expected to rise to about $58 billion in 2024. There are many major companies that have invested in the development of vaccines for many years. Pfizer, as an example, J&J, Merck, GSK, Sanofi, as well as a number of the smaller biotechs that we're seeing a lot of activity around, like Moderna, Novavax, Inovio, and others. The vaccine market tends to be segmented based on technology, as I indicated earlier, by region and which part of the world they're attempting to address, as well as by the type of disease area that they're focused on, from flu all the way to pneumococcal disease to hepatitis, measles, and so forth. We further see segmentation based on pediatric vaccines versus adult vaccines. And we have seen a growth of this market over the last few years, particularly given the increased incidence of infectious diseases. A few years ago, we were dealing with the Zika virus. There's the ongoing dengue virus as well, and the ongoing struggles against malaria and tuberculosis. And so the vaccine market has grown, as LJ indicated, because it takes so long for the development of these vaccines. They tend to be a very R&D heavy process, quite an expensive process, which is due to many different reasons, because of a high failure rate, which happens predominantly in the early stages of this. And because of all of these factors, what we're seeing right now is this unprecedented collaboration happening between the public and the private sector. And these collaborations are quite unique. I'll mention just a few of them, because what you're seeing are either combination of partnerships between a big manufacturing company that has the capacity and a smaller biotech, or between the federal government and respective agencies and these big companies. For example, Pfizer and BioNTech, they have developed a partnership around an mRNA vaccine to address the coronavirus. They're expecting to utilize each other's respective research and development sites and bringing different resources and expertise to bear. We recently saw the GSK and Sanofi collaboration, where in that collaboration, GSK will contribute their adjuvant technology, while Sanofi contributes the vaccine candidate itself. We also see great partnerships between Moderna, who just even recently, I think as of yesterday, received $483 million from BARDA. They're partnering with the National Institutes of Health, with CEPI, which is a coalition that has been pulled together to develop vaccines for emerging infectious diseases. And I can go on between J&J and BARDA and CureVac and CEPI. So all of these partnerships really help to bring either manufacturing capability to bear, or funding for manufacturing capability, or leverages different expertise that each of these companies have. So we're not talking about a decades-long collaboration, but rather something that could happen in under 18 months.
Great, thanks, Esther. And I do just want to ask one other quick follow-up that came in from the audience, which was, could you speak a little bit to the role of the World Health Organization in accelerating vaccine testing and deployment, and sort of combined with what can sort of multiple governments do globally to help to accelerate? And if you could just speak briefly to that, that would be great.
Yes, the WHO has established a platform study. Platform studies are based on adaptive clinical design protocol, where you can substitute in different compounds or candidates and quickly go through, because you've already determined the clinical trial design, quickly go through their study and leverage early data to inform what else comes in or what else goes out. WHO established the Solidarity clinical trial study, that is this multi-arm, adaptive clinical trial, which is quite important, as we know that we need many different options. We cannot, as you say, put all of our eggs in one basket. So if we can have studies like those that the WHO is sponsoring, and the role that they have in bringing together international partners, those are going to be, quite critical and quite effective and needed going forward. We've also seen international or other countries rather contribute to international organizations like CEPI that I mentioned earlier. The UK government has contributed to CEPI, as well as some Scandinavian countries that have contributed to the work of CEPI. CEPI is working in close collaboration with the Gates Foundation. Having these kinds of international cooperative agreements in place and coalitions in place that are funding the development of these vaccines is going to be critical. We need everyone to do what they can from their respective areas to speed us to this, hopefully what will be the most effective treatment.
Great, thank you.
So jump in quickly and also mention,
sure,
critically important for WHO here also is this idea of coordination, because of the fact that I think there's going to be unprecedented global efforts, and having research information shared across borders is going to become very important. And I think that's where WHO can also have a very important role.
Thanks, LJ. And that's a great segue into my next question, because I wanted to ask you, and we've had several audience questions come in along these lines about, as you talk about accelerating that development timeline from 10 years down to 12 to 18 months, what I know some have called the pandemic paradigm, and you talk about doing simultaneous trials instead of the sequential trials. Do those have greater material inherent risk as compared to sequential trials? So are they riskier? And then can you talk a little bit about the evidence? How is the evidence going to work in terms of really when you have so many different trials in process, so many different kinds of vaccine candidates? How will researchers be able to tell the safest and the most efficacious out of all of them? Maybe you could start there, and then Esther, jump in as you see fit.
Yeah, that's a huge question, obviously. I think when you talk about compressing the clinical trials, what we're essentially doing with overlapping trials is really going into humans quickly, doing a quick safety dose kind of selection quickly, and then moving quickly into kind of a safety efficacy trial, all happening at the same time, using adaptive trial design so that we can continue to adjust the clinical development as we get data out of those trials. So by doing that, what we allow us to do is to shorten the phase 1, 2, and 3 process faster. Now, this idea of 12 to 18 months is still really fast. So this is one of the things I think we have to figure out, right? Is this idea that the reason some of these clinical trials, especially a lot of manufacturing vaccine, stops at the phase 2 to phase 3 phase, because going into that phase 3 clinical trial is extremely that no-go, no-go decision is extremely difficult because of the cost of that final phase 3. And the reason why there's a cost is in that final phase 3, you're looking for efficacy data, safety data, and also a substantial amount of long-term data, right? So a lot of those clinical trials go out 2, 3, 4 years so that we have a sense of the long-term safety of the vaccine. The challenge we're going to have with these new vaccines is that some of the technologies, for example, mRNA technology has not been used in vaccines before, although mRNA technology has shown itself to be extremely safe in the labs. And because of all the biologic characteristics of mRNA, obviously, we still are going to have to figure out, what do we do in the absence of that long-term data? So of safety and efficacy, right? And I think that's where the use of the experimental use authorizations from FDA, those are things that we're going to have to look forward to seeing the FDA do in getting this vaccine to market. So I think that's an introduction. I think, Esther, do you want to jump in here with some thoughts about that?
I would just add, that was great, LJ. I would just add the manufacturing component as well in accelerating this. In that compressed timeline, what we're seeing is that companies are going ahead and developing the capability in order to quickly manufacture doses while we're going through clinical trials. I think that is quite unprecedented. We haven't seen that kind of activity ever before. And so even the announcement with BARDA and Moderna, the money that BARDA is investing is to develop manufacturing capabilities so that if we do get an FDA-approved vaccine, they can quickly be able to turn out potential millions of doses a month starting in 2020. We've seen J&J make the same commitment, as well as GSK and Sanofi with their collaboration. So adding that manufacturing capability and certifying those manufacturing sites early on will help to compress that time frame to actually be able to deploy it to many people.
And I have to say, actually, that's a really good point, because a lot of this is being done at risk to obviously the manufacturing partners as well. So it is unprecedented. So thank you for bringing that up.
Thanks. And as a quick follow-up, I know we've heard that the Gates Foundation also is investing in multiple manufacturing facilities. And as I understand it, it's not just to ramp up the production, it's because different vaccines with different technologies may require very different kinds of equipment and so on. Is that right?
That's right. You've also heard Bill Gates himself say that he expects to lose billions of dollars in doing that, right? Because you're scaling all of this up while you don't know which one will ultimately be successful. I do think what we see in some of these partnerships, as I mentioned earlier, is that combination of the small biotech that has some of the capabilities with these new technologies, like an mRNA platform or others, partnering up with a bigger company who has already had experience in manufacturing. For example, Moderna has not taken a vaccine all the way through to commercialization. So it's important for them to develop the manufacturing capabilities up front. Those who are partnering with folks like Pfizer or GSK or others, they have tremendous experience taking vaccines all the way through to commercialization and manufacturing. So being able to have that built in to your early plan will be quite critical.
Great. I want to ask one more question about the science of this and the scientific development, and then move to sort of what happens next. Can you talk about whether we know yet whether there's much variance in response to any of the vaccine candidates across race and gender, and what's being done to get participation in the studies that really reflect the diversity of the population?
I'll jump in first, Esther, and then you can go ahead and continue this. I think I think this is what I kind of touched on earlier in one of my slides, is this idea that I think with our trials now, we're going to have to obviously jump in where we can get results the fastest. And I think by that nature, we're going to jump into places where there's going to be disease. And I think that's probably the first driving point of enrollment into some of these trials is we got to go where the disease is and where we can get results fast. And then I think as we go into that, I think what we'll do then is obviously there will have to be a look at what you're enrolling, who you're enrolling, and then seeing whether you need to then change some of the demographics that you're looking at to account for things like gender equality and so on and so forth. But I think first and foremost, in order to get the results, you got to go in somewhere, and you need to go in where disease is, regardless of geography or socioeconomic status or so on and so forth. So that's the high level thought process, and then I think you adjust as you go. Esther, any thoughts there?
Well, in the early study that Moderna started in mid-March, they needed to enroll 45 healthy patients, largely in the Seattle region, Washington region, and I believe the first dose was in someone through the Kaiser Permanente's health system. So again, you're going to go to where you have those partners who are working with you, either academic research institutions. What NIH is bringing to bear are their already developed clinical trial networks. And so activating those quickly will be the key. And then, of course, reaching out to the respective patient populations that are part of either those networks or can be quickly enrolled. I do think you're raising important points, Sarah, around how do we ensure the right demographic distribution, and that reflects in the data of the early studies. But I think right now speed is the first factor, and having some of these other considerations will be important going forward.
Great, thanks. So I want to ask a question related to the speed of getting a vaccine, and we've had a couple questions come in around this, which is, are there trade-offs with regard to speed and safety? And of course, we inhabit a world in which we're all anxiously awaiting this vaccine, but not everybody sort of trusts vaccines necessarily. So what's that interplay? What are the key messages that need to be gotten out to the public, and what do we need to do to make sure that that the vaccine is safe as well as efficacious?
I mean, I can start on the speed versus safety component and have LJ's thoughts, which is in everything that I have seen in all of our discussions and interactions with a lot of these companies, they are not compromising safety. So safety is not being subverted for the sake of speed. What we're seeing in the amazing partnerships underway is bringing different expertise to bear to speed up the time frame where you traditionally would not have had the incentives to do that. And so that will help us to go faster. We obviously have regulatory bodies who are prepared and ready to be able to review these trial designs and to activate networks and to bring their own expertise to bear to make sure that things are going through the appropriate protocol. But safety is still the first and critical factor, and then, of course, efficacy, which is really what we need. The last thing I will say is that in order for us to go back to life as normal, we do need a vaccine. And so with vaccine hesitancy issues and so forth, we need to communicate, and I'm sure the public will understand that for us to go back to, going to our social lives as we had it, we ultimately need a vaccine in order to do that.
Esther, thank you. That was actually really well said. So the part about, I think, obviously the way you get through a pandemic is to get through it. And one of the big factors of helping us get through that, obviously, is not just the treatments that Esther was talking about, but ultimately this vaccine. I do think it's going to be interesting as this vaccine gets rolled out. A lot of the partners rolling these vaccines out, the public and private sector, are taking enormous risks on themselves to do this because it is a public health good here. And I think the big picture we want to message to everybody is vaccinations and vaccines are a public health good. And it's a social norm for protecting our populations against not just outbreak diseases, but existing vaccine preventable diseases as well. And so, I think we want to remember that we have an incredible track record in the U.S. and around the world of safe and effective vaccines. And that I do not expect and I don't anticipate that's going to be at all compromised in the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, even as quickly as these incredible partnerships are bringing the vaccine to market. So I think that's a really important message that we want to keep emphasizing to the public about the safety and efficacy of not just the COVID-19 vaccines that are being developed, but all vaccines that are currently approved by the FDA.
Well, thank you so much, LJ and Esther. And unfortunately, we are already out of time. Time flies, and there have been some great questions coming in from the audience. Unfortunately, we couldn't get to all of them, but we encourage you to continue to reach out to us, and we'll try to get back to you one-on-one with some responses. I want to thank LJ Tan and Esther Krofah for joining us today on the science and policy of vaccine development. We really appreciate your time and expertise. And I want to remind the audience that a recording of this webinar will be available on our website, allhealthpolicy.org, later today. Esther and LJ, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks.